All right. Well, hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday and welcome to RV Life Pro Product Training and Q&A. Good to be here this week. Today, we're going to cover the routing and driving tab within TripWizard in detail. But amidst that, if you have questions, comments, things you want to talk about, learn about, be sure and post those in the comments section. You're watching this live either on our RV Life Facebook page or our RV Life YouTube channel. Be sure and like and subscribe and thumbs up to all of that stuff so that you can be alerted when new videos and these live streams come out. We are wrapping up our summer here, just a couple of more of these to go through August, and then we'll be done for the season. So now's the time to get those questions out there. I am going to go to the, I'm going to share my TripWizard screen and then just mutter randomly until I get that screen up. How about that? There we go. Okay. Looking at my notes, I've got several things, and they're all encompassed within this routing and driving tab that we'll go over. I also, poking around YouTube last week, I made a tweak that maybe the quality of the broadcast will be a little bit better. Maybe it won't. I don't know. I hope so. But we'll do that. Comments on both YouTube and Facebook I can see those, so we'll address those as they come. And we're going to move on. I'm going to scoot this over to another screen here, make it a little bit easier to manage. I want to be able to see those comments as they come. And we're going to get started. Okay, so within RV TripWizard, we've all seen this under trip settings, this routing and driving tab. Now, you wouldn't think we could do a whole lot with this right here, but there's so much in here and so much to discuss about a lot of the little nuance in here that I thought it would be a good broadcast. And I might even be able to slice and dice this thing up to be a product training video that we could reuse down the road in sort of a small segment. So with that, today we'll talk about the routing and driving tab in TripWizard. The first thing we're going to see here, of course, at the top is this selection of RV routing or standard routing. There's very few reasons. There are very few reasons, and I wholly support the idea of never allowing that option. I think everything should be RV routing only. You shouldn't even get the option to do that. If you do, now at least we have a warning that says, look, this is standard routing. This isn't going to take into consideration your height, length, weight, all of that type of stuff. So make sure you understand that that's what you're doing. And of course, I'm going to flip it back to RV routing. What are the use cases for standard routing? A use case for standard routing would be somebody that wants all the benefits of TripWizard. They want to know where the campgrounds are. They want to know where to stop for fuel and all of those things, but they're not driving or pulling anything of any significant substance where that RV routing is a factor. Maybe a small Class B van. Maybe you've got a Jeep and you're putting one of those little tents on top, or you're pulling a pop-up or something like that. Something where the RV routing just is not needed for you, but you want all of these other benefits that TripWizard provides, that RV Life Pro provides. That might be a case for you to choose standard routing. Otherwise, don't touch it. Leave it on RV routing. We talked about the default settings, I think last week and in weeks past. Leave that on RV routing so that every new trip is set for RV routing. So that's that button. And when you get a warning that says, hey, I'm not going to take all these measurements into consideration, that should be a clue there to go back and switch that back over. Okay, the first setting here now besides that is avoid tolls. We've talked about this in the past, but I'm going to bring up, and you'll see me bouncing in and out of different trips here, but I'm going to bring up the perfect example of why we don't want to choose avoid tolls, or if you're going to choose it, it puts that burden on you to really vet your route carefully. So we're going to drop out of this trip real quick. I'm going to open the no tolls trip. And we've used this in the past. We've looked at it in the past. And here's a trip from St. Louis to this Denver East KOA with no tolls selected. Now, one would think this would be a quick jaunt down I-70 with virtually no thought to have to put behind this journey, right? But yet here we are from Kansas to Topeka. We've got this huge detour that we're being asked to take. And we wonder, why in the world am I going down to Emporia before I head back up? And that is because of the turnpike, that this is a toll road from this section of Kansas City of I-70 through Topeka. In fact, it says this is the Kansas Turnpike. And so because that's a toll, and you asked Trip Wizard, if we look at our settings here, you can see we've got avoid tolls selected. You're getting what you asked for, no tolls. So again, it's a fine setting if you really, really, really need to avoid tolls. But it comes with a caveat of understanding when you get routed in a crazy way, you need to know why. So this is a perfect example of that. I just don't think it's worth the hassle to avoid tolls. There was a little bit more merit to it in the past when you were worried about taking your rig through a skinny toll booth and all that sort of thing. They're big enough for 18-wheelers, but those guys and gals are practiced in going through that. RVers, not so much, so it made folks nervous. Now everything is, read your plate and go under. There's not hardly any toll booths around anymore, so it's a little bit different story. But so my recommendation here is don't avoid tolls, okay? So we're going to go back to our other trip, which is kind of my baseline section here that I'm working with. And our next setting is avoid highways. We've talked about this before as well. Of course, avoid highways can be a mess because it's going to do everything it can to take you off the highways. Once again, why have this setting? What's the use case for it? It can be pretty handy. And I actually have a trip to show you for that, which I would have opened if I could have remembered the name of it. We're going to look at this little trip called Fredericksburg. So if you, we're here obviously in the DFW area, and there's a little town in Texas here called Fredericksburg. It's a neat little town. A lot of write-ups been done on it. It's an interesting place to go. German influence, and neat place, et cetera, right? So from the DFW area, here's how we would get to Fredericksburg, right? Take 35 all the way down through Austin to San Antonio and come back up. Whoops. Well, if you know the area, you know that's an efficient route, but it is no fun. It's not an interesting route to see visually, and it's a bit of a traffic nightmare. But this is a short 4 or 5 hour trip from DFW. Here's a great case where avoid highways makes a lot of sense. I can come in here, choose my trip settings, my routing and driving, choose avoid highways. And now if we look at this trip, it's actually even shorter. And it's a much more scenic route through the western hills and whatnot of Texas. Hills is a strong word here, but through West Texas. Now it's a little bit slower, right? It's a longer, the time is a little bit more, but from a mileage, let me say that a different way. It is a shorter route, but there's a ton of stops and starts and things. far and away, if you're going to Fredericksburg and you live in this area, this is a much nicer route to take. But by default, TripWizard is going to route you on those fast freeways and try to make that route as easy as possible. It's thinking in terms of an 18-wheeler or a truck or that type of thing, and that's how it's going to route you. So this is a case where the avoid highways makes perfect, wonderful sense for a nice drive into Fredericksburg. Okay, let's see what my next trip is. Looks like I can go back to my normal trip. So the next setting we will look at is the avoid ferries. So obviously here for most of us in the country, this setting isn't a big concern. If you had a supersized rig, or you just were afraid of boats, or you didn't want to get on, you just didn't want to deal with ferries and those types of things, you could select avoid ferries. This will be really manifest in the Northwest, where there's a lot of ferry stuff going around in that Oregon, Portland, Washington, that whole area up there. There's a lot of ferry, and up in the UP, I think there's some ferries around there, and I think is the operative word. I don't know for sure. I know there's some up there. The point is, if this is something you don't want to do, and I think of myself with a big diesel pusher pulling a Jeep where I don't have any effective way to back up should there be a reason to, I would be inclined not to want to get on a ferry. I've never done it, and I would have to address that when the time came. But if for some reason this was something you did not want to do, choosing to avoid ferries is a great idea. Now, here's the little catch. A great comment by Sandy. I just love this. And if you avoid highways, you'll miss the Wizard of Oz Museum in Wamego, Kansas. Love that. Hey, Sandy. Anyway, so the avoid ferries and avoid tolls is they have an interesting relationship, because a ferry gets you from point A to point B. Is a ferry free? No, it is not. It is a toll. So there's a possibility that you could be routed around potential ferries you wish to take because you have avoid tolls selected. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. If you've got a route going, you're like, hey, why won't it let me take the ferry? I have avoid ferries is not selected. Why won't it let me? And it could very well be because you have avoid tolls selected. So just another thing to keep in mind there. Avoiding tunnels. So there really should not be a reason to choose avoid tunnels. A couple of reasons. Number one, if we're telling TripWizard our proper dimensions and the fact we're carrying propane or not, it should route us around tunnels that are either too low to get under or that propane is absolutely not allowed. Now, a lot of tunnels will tell you, look, pull over and close your propane.
1 sec.
Dude, I'm not talking to you. My phone's talking to me. Still
working.
Some tunnels, I'll turn the volume on. Some tunnels will say, look, pull over, turn off your propane, then go under. Some tunnels, not that many, but some are absolutely, you will not go here. And obviously the ones that are too short for your rig. TripWizard is going to take all that into consideration and route you around that stuff. So there's not a real reason to avoid tunnels unless your headlights aren't working, right? Maybe you're only driving in the day because your headlights aren't working, or they're bad or terrible or whatever. You have claustrophobia and you just don't feel comfortable in a tunnel. I had to look this one up. You have gephorophobia. Maybe I said that right, which is mostly the fear of bridges, but they lump tunnels into that thing as well. So those are the only reasons I can think of to avoid tunnels. If you have more, we'd love to hear them. But for the most part, there's no need to select that because that's already dealt with, right, through your routing. And avoid unpaved roads. Now, I generally will keep avoid unpaved roads selected. Some of this comes from a shortcut that I took on my own before I was using Trip Wizard a few years ago. And the shortcut looked great on Google Maps and it looked great on paper, but it turned out to be a gravel road about 5 miles long, and it was a miserable 5 miles. My rig looked like it had been, through a cross-country event, and it was only 5 miles in. And so I pull into a high-end luxury RV resort for the first time in my life, and my rig looks like it was in Breaking Bad or something, So I have unpaved roads on. Now, let me show you a little bit of nuance about this. We get this question a lot, so we're going to talk about it. Let me open my Monument Valley trip real quick. And we can see right here. So if we look at this trip, this is a very common scenario. We're looking at this route, and we see a big exclamation mark in the middle of our road that says, and then we look over here to the left, it says no route available without an unpaved road. And we're looking at this going, good Lord, I-60 is unpaved, or suddenly Highway 64 is not paved. What's going on? Why is this here, right? So we get a little panicky. We see this big exclamation mark, and right away we're like freaking out. However, let's break it down just a little bit. If we look at this, the first thing we need to know is the exclamation mark will always be centered on the segment in question. So that means somewhere between Shiprock, New Mexico and Goulding's Lodge, there's an unpaved something I need to worry about. This is a good sidebar, a good question here. And so Roy mentions that avoiding highways may lead to issues with fuel availability, especially big fifth wheels and diesel. So it's 100% true. And as we built out our trip, we would have probably discovered that, or we would hope we would discover that. We certainly put the burden on vetting out those small fuel stations versus being able to choose larger ones. And it's all in the process. It's lay down a route, lay down the campgrounds, lay down the fuel, lay down the rest areas. And as you start building that cohesive trip, it exposes some of those problems. So that's a great point, Roy. Excellent point. So on back to our avoid paved roads example. So when I look at this trip, I get this big exclamation in the middle of my segment. It's up to me now to vet this out. Is this a concern? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this and I'm going to look for the little symbol. Now, some of you with sharp eyes probably saw it bobbing up and down here under the Goulding's Lodge. Oh, there it is. So if I zoom in real close, we can see that in fact what they're telling me here is this little last lead-in into Goulding's might have an unpaved or a gravelly situation. I can go to Street View. I can go to Satellite View. You're actually going to see this a lot in front of some campgrounds. So, and if we're not sure, we don't even have to go here. Let's just go to Street View. In fact, we can even get fancy and just right-click right here and go Street View. Now we should be able to see. Now, if I picked a good spot, which I didn't, let's try this again. Let's try it right here. Kind of depends on where the Google truck went or didn't go. Either I have terrible internet or I'm not doing a good job of it. Let's drag this little guy down here. Now, I would question my internet. Oh, here we go. And I'm in the lodge. So go. That's not very specific. We've done it before here. We've dragged and looked at Street View, and obviously I would look for a gravel section or whatever. I can know with comfort here if I vet this out a little bit more. I mean, I could go to Satellite View. We're not in a big hurry, right? Go to Satellite Map, and I can see. And real often you're going to find, and I've been here before, and I know that this little section right in here leading into was a little bit of a gravel incline. Now they might come back and pave that later and it might not get reported right away. But the point is we look at that, we go, oh, that's that last little road going into the campground, happens all the time. I don't need to worry about it. Now, because of that, not needing to worry about it, do I want to turn off avoid unpaved roads? No, I don't, at least not yet. Now, once I get I just know that I don't need to worry about this glaring exclamation mark on my route. Now, once I get the trip completely built as far as route and campgrounds, and now I'm ready to do all the other stuff we just talked about, fuel stops, Walmart, groceries, restaurants, rest areas, all the other stuff I want to build into my trip, I could go ahead and turn that off just so I don't have to be confused or annoyed by that exclamation mark, right? I'm not. Now, the good news is I still see my little sign here. I just don't have that big exclamation mark in the way. But again, I only want to do this when my route is planned. I don't want to do it before that because I'm annoyed at one area and then I end up creating a route down the road that's through a 5-mile gravel shortcut, right? So leave it on, but you could turn it off once your route is complete. But that is the avoid unpaved roads. It's very valuable. It at least gives you the opportunity to look at something and vet it carefully to make sure you're willing to go down that road. We've brought up some good examples before, and I was going to see if I could find where this unpaved disaster I took many years ago was, but I think I'm just scarred. I'm not going to be able to find it. So, all right, let's move on to some more settings here. Let's look at our questions first. Good question right here. So, used Trip Wizard for the first time last week for a Florida trip. Was happy, but I was doing something wrong to have it go back to the trip after each gas stop and select the next destination in the trip. No, I would not say you had to do you did anything wrong. And I wouldn't say that anything was tied specifically to fuel stops. So the question here I would pose is, with Trip Wizard, we always want to plan and add our fuel stops ahead of time. We have that ability. Now, folks that are in smaller rigs perhaps don't want to do that or don't even have to do that. If you're in a very small rig, a little Class B, or pulling something small and you can literally get into any fuel station, you might not care to do the planning ahead. You might just choose to wing it. If the latter is the case, then yes, if you're going to get off that route and go to a fuel station somewhere, you're going to need to kind of restart the next segment of your trip to keep going because you've deviated from the route. If you're adding all your fuel stops ahead of time, then that fuel stop is a destination. And once I fill up, I go back to my app and I've already planned my next. I just tap on whatever my next destination is. It might be a fuel stop 3 hours from now. It might be a rest area an hour from now. It might be the campground. It might be a scenic overlook. Whatever I've planned into my trip, that's what my next destination is. So yeah, if you kind of go off the script, then you have to get back on that script by going and choosing your next destination. If you're following the trip exactly, it should be more obvious and more fluid. So hope that helps a little bit. So back to our routing and driving. We've discussed our routing, RV and standard. We've discussed the avoids. Now we get into the driving time estimates. And there's two options here, obviously. There is the routing engine estimate, and then there is your average driving speed. So I've always been more a proponent of the average driving speed because I can control it infinitely. Right now, you can see I have this set for 58 miles per hour, which seems oddly specific, but it is in fact where I kind of know where we are. Average driving speed is not what do I average on the freeway. It's throughout the course of a day, what is my average driving speed? It's kind of like a marathon or something. Somebody's running, they might be sprinting, they might be jogging, they might be walking, but their average speed is X, or 24 hours of Le Mans, or whatever the case may be. So throughout the course of a day, what is your average driving speed? Do you have kids and pets? Are you stopping every 2 hours? So this is where I started out. It was every 2 hours. It was a rest area or something to stop at. Rest area, fuel, lunch, blah, blah, blah. It was a 2-hour intended stop because of pets. And I found my average driving speed to be 50 to 55 miles an hour. I was fiddling around with different speeds there. Now we take shorter trips with no stops, and my average speed is up higher. It's closer to that 58 miles an hour. So this is something you can control infinitely. The routing and driving estimate is kind of what the software assumes, and it's based on the vehicle types. So if you are we don't stop for nothing type of a driver, or you make one stop, it's based again on these 18-wheeler thoughts and calculations. And we know, they're more inclined to go 5 and 6 hours at a time, stop once, finish the journey. So you can experiment with those a little bit to see what works best for you. Another good way to gauge this. So if I leave this on use routing estimate, and here's a way to gauge this. And if I leave is to take a trip, I think I want to open it. Well, we'll just take this trip. Most of us have a place that we know how long it takes us to get there, especially if we leave in our RV and we do it frequently. It's like, well, I always know I go here, and then from there we go some direction. You can look at that and say, well, the routing and driving engine says I'm going to be here in 3 hours. We're never there in 3 hours. It always takes 4 hours, right? So that's a good indicator that that's not going to work for you. Go back and let's use this other sample, or use this other setting, and instead of that, let's use our average driving speed and play with some numbers there. If you find that, hey, no matter where I go, this average driving speed is spot on for me, then go ahead and use it. It's just, again, we want to have the flexibility for you to choose what works best for you. I've always used average driving speed because I have fine-tuned it over the years. Let's answer Sandy's question real quick. Is there a way to add web links that will open in comments? I copied a link, but it isn't a URL that will open. Well, let's find out. Let's pull up a website. National Vehicle is a good one. All right, maybe you want to sell your RV. So what I do is, so the secret here, Sandy, I bet you, let's find out. Your browser tries to help you, and it shows you only that. And if you copy just that, it's not going to do you any good. But if we click in there, let's click in there. Oh, I didn't want that. You can see how by clicking into it and highlighting the whole thing, it exposes that https:// we want that. So let's go put that in a comment. Let's see if it does anything. I don't know if it will, but we'll find out. So we'll paste that in there. Now, if I go look at those comments, so no, that link is not clickable. However, I can now copy, paste, just to prove that again, paste and go. So yeah, the danger, I can tell you this right now, Sandy, the danger of us making this clickable is that if you somehow paste in or a partial link or a wrong link, or it accidentally gets dumped on top of some comments and mixed in and somehow creates a link that takes you to a bad place, we don't have any way to control that. And essentially, you clicked on something in TripWizard and it took you to a bad site. It'll feel like it's our fault, but it's really not. And there's just no way to control that. So the best thing is paste it in there. And then when you need to reuse it, copy and paste it back out to the web link. And that should help you get there. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit helpful. We were on routing and driving. So just to close loop back on that, on the routing and driving estimate, figure out what works for you and experiment. Again, most of us know taking our RV somewhere that where it's going to take us. And I think with the example I have on the screen, let me see what my notes say. Yeah, let me pull up this other trip because I have a nice visual for this. And we'll be in Amarillo, and we can go here. Let's see if we're on routing and driving. Save. Okay, so if we're in Amarillo and we look at our entire trip, our routing and driving estimate shows us to get just outside of Albuquerque in a day's driving in whatever we have specified. However, so you can see that's putting us just west of Albuquerque, almost to Bruckner. If we go in and tweak that same setting and say, no, I've learned my average driving speed in this case is really 55 miles an hour. We're going slow, we're driving a big rig, we're pulling a Jeep, we got kids, we got dogs, whatever. But we just know that's our speed. Let's see how that looks now back on our trip. And we can see that at that speed, we're not going to get anywhere near Albuquerque. And why is this important? Look, it's important in your fuel management. It's important in your timing. You know, if you're booked at the Route 66 resort right outside of Albuquerque, and after 4 or 5 hours driving or whatever it is, you're only at Klein's Corners, you're like, oh my God, we're going to be late. We're going to be tired. We're going to be hungry. Whatever the case may be, whatever the reason is, you're not going to be anywhere near where you thought you were going to be at the right time. This is a huge mistake new RVers make all the time. You know, they say, oh, well, we're driving 6 hours. It's 70 miles an hour, 420 miles. We'll be there in X. And they don't take into account how much slower they're going, how much more frequently they stop, and all of those things. You know, it isn't like you pull into a rest area and use the restroom and you're out in 2 minutes. In an RV, it's a much longer process, and all of those things. So we all know that as RVers. New RVers don't know that yet, but this is a perfect example where tweaking that routing and driving is important. Donna wants to know what version of Android OS. Oh, no, well, let's see. No, actually, Donna's helping Sandy. And Donna's answering that question. So Donna you guys can read that in the comments. But the conversation is about Android and Google changing some privacy settings. So good job, Donna, always on top of things. And good job on Sandy, always with some good questions. So while they're hashing that out, we'll move on a little bit. So that's a really important lesson on using your speed and routing and driving. And again, we've changed our speed over the years. Now I'm generally closer to 58 or even 60 miles an hour because I'm not stopping at all, but I'm only driving 4 to 5 hours. So, okay, the driving radius. Now we've done a whole segment on driving radius, but it actually has been a while. So let's talk about the driving radius. First of all, let's take it from top to bottom. Don't show a driving radius means just that. Don't show it. Okay, easy. Everybody understands that. We also understand that the driving radius settings are available in this menu. And as we have seen, they're available in this menu. And they basically mean the same thing. And you can tell from the little pictures here. So the classic radius is that, you know, as the crow flies, radius, which is circular and does, it's a miles by air estimate or time, whereas the advanced radius actually takes the posted road times and things into effect. And you can see whichever road I decide to go down, that's actually how far it's going to be. So that's the difference between the advanced and the classic. Now within that realm, there's two other settings we can look at. Number one, in both of those examples, we saw a single ring or a single radius. And that's because I have it set on hours per day. And we see that that's set on 4 hours. So whether if I do the classic radius, it shows me 4 hours in a as the bird flies, as the crow flies kind of range. And if I'm on the advanced radius, it shows 4 hours of driving down every single road that radiates from that center point. Now, obviously here from Amarillo to Albuquerque, it's just a straight westerly shot down a virtually straight road. And so there's not a lot of difference. But the minute we get turns and twists in the route, it can be a huge difference. And you can be off by an hour in your route. If you're using the classic radius, you can be off by a fair degree because of those twists and turns and jukes in the road. Now, within both of those realms is a little bit where we can do multiple rings. The hours are always going to be one ring, okay? Whether I'm showing advanced or classic, if I'm using hours, I get one single ring. But suppose I want to go by miles. So I can choose miles and I can set minimums, 200, 250, 300. Let's see what that looks like. And we'll go back to our Amarillo and you can see it creates a bit of a scary looking amoeba thing here. But if we break it down, it's actually pretty handy because we can see that if we leave Amarillo, we can see by the yellow exactly where our 250 mark is. And this is straight up exactly 250 miles from our start point. And then we can see, okay, so 200 is back here, 300 is up here. This gives me sort of a window, sort of a pocket to know where I'm going to end up. And so if my desired range is 250, I can look at this and say, wow, if I want to get to Route 66, for example, that's almost 300 miles. I got to drive an extra hour to get there. Am I willing to do that? And you can make that decision ahead of time while you're planning. I might look at that and say, well, if we're staying 2 or 3 nights in Amarillo, we'll be raring to go, and that extra hour isn't a big deal. Or we might flip it and say, look, I just want to get out of Amarillo, so yeah, I'm willing to drive an extra hour, right? Whatever the case may be, the idea is you're deciding where I want to stop. If the 3 rings is a little overwhelming, but you still want to use miles versus hours, I'm an hours advocate because it just makes more sense for us. But if you want to do miles, but you don't like all 3 rings, you say, look, I don't care about any of that. I want to drive 300 miles. That's it. Don't mess with me. Then no problem. Let's put 300 in every spot. Okay. Now I'm going to get one driving radius that is exactly 300 miles. And now I can make decisions on which campgrounds I wish to use. And of course, I can click on this and say, this is a great example here. I chose 300 as my distance. We can see this is 299 miles from my start point. Why do I know that? Because it says 299 right here, and this mileage is always measured from what's selected in the left-hand window. I decide, hey, if I want to stay at Enchanted Trails, it's only 290 miles. This KOA is only 272 miles. It doesn't matter. I'm deciding where I want to stay. I'm deciding how far I want to drive. And Trip Wizard is showing me exactly where I'm going to be at that mileage point. So that's how that works. Again, I'm not as big on miles as I am hours. If I look at this setting and say, yeah, look, I'm willing to drive 58 miles an hour, but I really want to do hours, but I'm willing to drive 5 hours. Now I can save that and I can review this scenario again. And I can see that at 58 miles an hour and 5 hours, I'm not going to make it to Route 66, but I'm willing to drive a little extra that day to get there, right? And that's how this is used. If suddenly we looked at my 4 hours is going to put me on this side of Albuquerque, and then I have to really decide, do I want to stay somewhere different, or do I want to push that extra hour that day and get to Route 66? And that's where that planning comes in. So I said we take shorter trips without stops. All of a sudden, I'm looking at 6 hours in the vehicle. There's going to be a stop. So I've got to look at that halfway point, figure out where I want to stop, plan that. Is it a rest area? Where do we want to go? Do we want to pull at a Walmart where I could stock up on groceries and find a way to take the dogs out, or whatever I want to do? I'm planning all that. I'm scheming all that ahead of time because I know exactly where I'm going to be at the end of the day. I've mentioned my first time RVing, where we drove. I looked at Flagstaff to Amarillo, no problem, right? Well, it's 10 hours, as you can see right here. This was on the way home, and we had come back through that way through a series of events, but I just did not anticipate when it was time to leave what that drive from Flagstaff to Amarillo, on Google Maps, it's no problem, right? In an RV, a Class A RV at that time was a gasser that we were renting, and you're going across the Western Plains here, and the wind, and I'm holding on to that steering wheel. That was the longest 10 hours of my life, but I didn't know those things, and I didn't have these tools to plan. And that's the goal of these things, is understand how they work so you can avoid that beatdown of, just literally collapsing into bed after a day behind the wheel. So, okay, that's routing and driving. Let's go back to our tool here, checking for comments. Sandy and Donna are getting things straight. That's great. One of the things I mentioned early on, or forgot to mention early on, was in my notes to do it, and I still didn't do it. Theoretically, I've got closed caption turned on. So if you're watching on YouTube and there's the closed caption button, in theory, it should work. Best I can tell you at this point. Okay, let's look at our next setting. We talked about the driving radius. We've talked about the advanced versus the classic. We've looked at hours versus miles and our average per day. And that's actually it for that. Let me just look at my my notes. So I think that's it on the routing and driving. If you have questions about that, I'd love to hear them. One of the reasons, we went for hours versus miles is because it was just simpler for me to gauge. It's like I knew I didn't want to be behind the wheel. And in fact, my number used to be 6 hours. I knew I didn't want to be behind the wheel for more than 6 hours. A lot of folks will use the 330 miles or be there by 3:30 p.m. And that's a handy rule to have. But for me, it was difficult to place. Whereas with hours, particularly when we were at that 6 hour, that was our MO, right? It was 6 hours of driving. Bear in mind, 6 hours of driving meant 7 hours behind the wheel. because we had an hour of stops between rest areas, fuel, dog breaks, snack breaks, lunch breaks, whatever the case may be. We ended up really being behind the wheel 7 hours. And so that's where I actually ended up here with my 5 hours. And now that 5 hours turned into 6 hours behind the wheel with stops. And depending on where I'm going, I might even back it down to those 4 hours without stops. But if we think about the 6 hour logic, the idea was that assuming we weren't sprinting across the country just to get somewhere, we were taking an actual RV trip. The idea was that after breakfast and catching up on email and taking the dogs out, we'd be ready to leave the RV park by 10, right? Most of them, you got to be out by 11 anyway. We'd be out by 10. 6 hour day puts me at the next stop at 4 p.m., which is well in time to get into camp, to get set up in the daylight, to get into the office before they close and address any issues. You know, you show up at a campground at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, yeah, your packet's clipped to the late night bulletin board outside the office, but if you have any problems, you're not going to be able to address them very easily. Yeah, they might have a guy on call or a camp host, and that's great, but you're dealing with that now at 7 or 8 o'clock at night after a long day on the road. So our theory was always just I can get to camp, get to the next destination by 4 p.m., get settled. We got a nice, relaxing night. It's not too late if I want to pull out the grill and cook or whatever the case may be. So that's how I came about our mileage or our hours and whatnot. It's different for everybody. You may have a trip. And what's nice about these settings being customizable is you might have a trip that is nothing more than sprinting across the country to deal with an issue at home, or sprinting across the country to deal with a deadline, or wow, your house closed and now you just need to get home and sign, right? So you might put, look, I'm willing to drive 8 hours. I'm going to pull into or 10 hours. I'm going to pull into a pull through, and we're not going to do nothing but sleep and get back on the road. Tweak the settings for that trip and plan it. That's the beauty of TripWizard, is that flexibility to do whatever you're doing. And you might just have 4 or 5 one-nighters to get across the country to get done, but you can still plan it and you can still take the mystery. You know, when you're traveling like that, all of a sudden your normal fuel stops and things that you're used to doing are different places. Now you don't know exactly where you can get fuel. And so you're thinking, geez, all of this is new because I'm driving in a new and different way than I normally do. Use TripWizard to plan those fuel stops and put them in there so you don't have to wonder. Even if you are sprinting across the country, you can still have a plan. So those are my thoughts on routing and driving. I don't have much else this week. We obviously, I guess it's almost been an hour, so I'll give a last call for questions for anybody that's out there that might have some that would like to see them addressed. We've covered virtually everything in TripWizard this summer. I'm looking at the calendar, and I see 2 more sessions left on the calendar before we wrap it up for the year. So that's the 24th and the 31st, and that will do it for the season. Remember to subscribe and like and thumbs up and all of those good things. Just checking my comments and checking my notes. I'll make sure I didn't leave anything off. No, I think we're good. Okay, so I'm going to give it another 30 seconds for any last minute questions to come in, knowing there's a little bit of a delay here. And you'll find, if you're watching this for the first time, reminder, you'll find these in our live stream playlist category, if you will, on the RV Life YouTube channel. Thinking about it now, I think I forgot to move last week's into that section, so I'll do both of them this week. Facebook will hold on to videos for a while. I don't know how long. It's 30 days maybe. So if it's something you're interested in, always subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way you'll know, you'll get alerted. Obviously, any new training videos that are created will go there. If you're in the Hershey, if you're going to be at the Hershey RV show in September, come by the booth and say hi. We'll be downstairs in the bowl where the Hershey Bears play a little hockey, so they convert that into a nice vendor area. So come by and say hi. That's going to be about it. I've got nothing else. We've got no more comments, so we'll wrap that up. Have a good week. We'll see you next week, and live your best RV life. Until then, thanks.